Hold on, sorry.
Yep.
Cool.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in the Rainbow Room. Today we are hosting one of our various events as part of the Gender and Sexual Diversity Research Group, which is a newly established research group within the university. We sit under the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center. And today we're delighted to present or to bring to you Tom Newton's research entitled Schrödinger, Homophobia is Alive and Dead. Hopefully I said that right. Doublethink in the Log Cabin Republicans. Tom Newton is an associate lecturer here at London Metropolitan University, teaching on first and second year comparative US and politics modules. He's currently also in his revision stage for his PhD at the University of Reading, where he also holds an associate lecturer teaching position. His research specializes in authoritarian and populist far-right rhetoric, with a particular focus on LGBTQ+ politics. His thesis, which is entitled "The Cost of a Place at the Table: Homo-Authoritarianism and the Log Cabin Republicans in Trump's America," is due to be finished this year. So congrats on that in advance. Tom is a new member of the research group, and we're very delighted to hear more about the work that he has produced and to also hear about what will be next from this research. So with much further ado, thank you so much for coming. By the way, I'm Dr. Sebastian Cordova. I'm one of the chairs of the research group, yeah, I'm delighted to be part of this group and to introduce an exciting array of speakers for this group. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you all for coming. It's really, really nice to be here and to get to chat with you. I did have an introductory slide, but Sebastian has kindly taken care of that for me. Yes, I'm Tom. It's lovely to meet you guys. And I will be presenting some of the work that has gone into my PhD that I have been bashing my head against for the last 5 years, God help me, at the University of Reading. I'm pleased to say my Viva went really, really well back in October, albeit I do have major revisions, as the thesis was, I believe the technical term is a brick. It was very big and needs to be trimmed down a fair bit to reflect the really good defence that I gave of it. So I will be, cross fingers, finishing that with no need for a second Viva in the summer. Particularly, as I said, I look at the phenomenon of LGBT conservatism in the context of Trump's America. LGBT conservatism is a very under-researched topic in academia. There's been very little attention paid to it. And the last time there was any sort of sustained, there has been a couple of other papers in the last year, but the last time there was any real sustained look at this demographic was long enough ago that if you said Donald Trump was going to be president back then, you would have been laughed out of whatever room you were in. Needless to say, the political situation has changed. And I looked at how the Log Cabin Republicans, who are a key American gay conservative group, we'll get onto them in a minute, changed so much of their outlook and their rhetoric over the course of the Trump years. What I'm going to present on today is one aspect of the research I did, but the broader thesis is on populism and authoritarianism and how this group has changed to be diehard, uncritical, loyal supporters of the Trump administration and the implications that has. It was a critical discourse analysis study. I looked at 1,300 tweets over the span of a year. These tweets were sent by Log Cabin, their chief account, some of their city level chapters, and some of their leaders over an 8-year period from the 20th of January 2013, which was the first full day of Obama's second term, through to January 19th, 2021, the last full day of the Trump administration. And I spent a year hand coding each of these tweets with some inductive methods, trying to see what they were telling me, basically. I didn't go in with many preconceived notions and discovered quite a lot along the way inductively, some of which I'm going to talk about today. needless to say, it was a miserable year, but I think has been quite illuminating for me. As I said, there's also the populist and authoritarian aspect of how log cabin try and mobilise their demographics to oppose things like the so-called woke mob and get a gay activist elite, as they call it, as well as the Democratic Party, trying to conjure the notion of how the left wing are actually the people who oppress gay people and the right wing want to emancipate them, as well as broader commitments to right-wing authoritarianism. They're trying to sabotage the accountability of the Trump administration, undercut any criticism of him, and so on. My broad idea is this notion of homo-authoritarianism. There is existing political work on LGBT identity formation and political behaviours. We have academic terms for the notion of homonormativity, which is this idea of campaigning for and winning LGBT rights by stressing how normal you are, talking about things like, we are just the same as our straight neighbours, we live the same lives as them, there's nothing fundamentally different about our lives except the people we love. So don't oppress us because we're just like you. And the problems with that being so many of us don't fit the heteronormative mould for various reasons. There's also this notion of homo-nationalism, which is brilliant theory articulated by Jasbir Puar from 2007 that talked about how in the post 9/11 world, not only did it's basically it was arguing that it wasn't a coincidence that it's post 9/11 that we get a lot more acceptance of gay rights in the Western world, because it was politically easier for conservatives and mainstream society to pick on Muslims instead of LGBT people. And you had this running trend of not only would you see, if you went to a gay bar in America, you'd probably see the Stars and Stripes plastered up everywhere after 9/11. You would also see political actors talking about how they would protect the gay community from so-called radical Islam. So you basically taking advantage of how the spectre had moved on to a different demographic. My argument builds off of this. Again, it's brought on this notion of LGBT people winning acceptance by doing something problematic. In this case, winning acceptance by latching on to and supporting authoritarian leaders and undermining democracy and in many ways their own self-interest to do that. The key vehicle for this that I want to talk about today is this notion of doublethink. Doublethink's a term that George Orwell came up with in his famous novel 1984. For those who haven't read it, it is a dystopian novel that he wrote in 1949, based off of his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, gave him a lifelong hatred of totalitarianism. And in this book, he envisioned a future where all of humanity is oppressed by a series of pan-continental totalitarian governments that oppress people's everyday lives in various different ways. And the particular one that the book's protagonist lives in what used to be the UK, controls its people by an ideology referred to as doublethink, which is, if you've ever heard the famous summary of it, Big Brother is always right. The state's ideology is that it is never wrong, even if what it does now contradicts what it did 5 minutes ago. And people are expected to change their beliefs on the fly and change them back in order to always reflect this notion that Big Brother is always right. The example Orwell gives is simultaneously believing that the state is legitimate because it protects democracy, but that the state's authoritarianism is legitimate because democracy is impossible. Two beliefs that contradict each other yet held simultaneously. There has actually been very, very minimal attention, because it was something that's come out of fiction. There's been very, very minimal attention paid to it academically as something that is actually part of authoritarian behaviour. The term, if you keyword search doublethink on a journal article website, you will find very few hits. Most of the ones you will find are about conspiracy theories. Psychological analysis has found the concept of doublethink quite interesting. There was a famous study on conspiracy theories about a decade ago called Dead and Alive. That's part of the reason why I've called this today. which sadly it's a debunked theory, but a very interesting one. They argued that there was a correlation between conspiracy theorists that believed Princess Diana had been murdered by the royal family and people that also simultaneously believed she was still alive and living in hiding, believing that she was simultaneously dead and alive, because both of those were equally shared the sort of higher order belief that the official narrative is wrong. That paper got debunked eventually, but is still proven of interest to psychological research. There's been very little political writing on it. Good exception, though, there was a great paper a couple of years ago by Andrew Allen Johnson about doublethink in the context of the Thai government and policies of the Thai government that are cracking down on Muslim resistance in the south of Thailand, that argued that a lot of people advocate and buy into lies that they know are lies in order to join an effective community of believers, to be part of the mainstream, be part of the inner circle. That particular paper was talking about how there's this sort of, the Thai military uses bomb detection kits that are pseudoscientific, they don't work, but telling people that they work creates a false sense of security that everyone buys into and legitimizes the state's use of them to crack down on Muslims in the south of Thailand. Beyond that, very, very little use of this term, and I think we really should be paying more attention to it. I've talked about log cabin a few times. I promise I'm actually going to get onto my work eventually and not just the setup. If you look at American voting patterns, roughly 1 in 4 LGBT people in the US regularly votes for the Republican Party, which, when I tell people that, the normal response I get is eyes popping out of skulls going, oh my God, gay Republicans exist? Isn't that the party that wants to like end gay marriage? And yes, it is. But normally speaking, you get this 1 in 4, 25, between sort of 20 and 25% in a given election that will stand up and say, yes, I'm gay, but I also support gun rights. I also support strong borders. I also support low taxes and so on. So I pull myself to the Republican Party for that. And the log cabin Republicans are their main political representation. The name log cabin comes from the might be apocryphal legend that Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. It's meant to try and evoke that we want to take the Republican Party back to the days when it emancipated people. When they were set up, they were one of a series of gay Republican groups. The term Lincoln Republicans went around quite a bit. By this point, log cabin are the only group. They've either absorbed the rest or the others have died out. Sometimes groups split off from them and they normally have short reaches and shorter shelf lives. Log cabin is active in every state and they have had a rough time of it, I hasten to add. They've been active since 1977. They were founded in San Francisco to fight California Proposition 6, which was a referendum on banning gay people from being teachers. They had some initial support from Ronald Reagan back when he was first running for president, and they've been active ever since. They've had a bit of a rough time of it because they have often been picked on by more mainstream LGBT activist groups for being Republicans, and likewise being gay Republicans means they also take a lot of flack from their own party. This picture is of a demonstration in 1997 where they were banned from attending the Republican Party convention in Texas, and they protested outside and obviously got counter-protested by Christian nationalists who claimed that they were, all the horrible things Christian nationalists say about gay people. Historically speaking, this is not a group that was uncritically loyal to the party, uncritically loyal to any one leader. They've pulled endorsements from Republican presidential candidates in the past. If you've never heard of the Dole check scandal back in the mid-90s, Bob Dole was quite fond of log cabin initially. They donated some money to his campaign. Homophobic members of his staff returned the donation because it had come from a gay group. Dole then defended that decision, even though he'd gotten on quite well with log cabin leadership, so log cabin pulled their endorsement of it. They also refused to endorse George Bush Sr. in 1992, Bush Jr. in 2004, after he'd come out in support of federal marriage amendments, and they'd refused to endorse Donald Trump in 2016. They then went on 4 years later to 3 years later, very enthusiastically endorsed Donald Trump in 2020. Or rather, they endorsed him in 2019, a full year ahead of the presidential election, before the Republican primaries had even taken place. This is a group that had previously stood on the position of, we want to make the Republican Party an inclusive place from the inside, because there is nothing, because the Republican Party ostensibly is a libertarian organization. The state should not be telling people who they can and can't sleep with. We want to end the influence of Christian nationalism and make the party a better place for gay people, so that when the White House changes hands every 4 to 8 years, gay people aren't suddenly thrown under the bus by having a homophobic party in office. If you study their rhetoric, as I have over the 4 years of the Trump administration, this changed. To say they think Trump is the greatest thing since sliced bread would be an understatement. They think he's the greatest thing that's happened to the American gay community ever. What was my next slide? In his defense, which is not a sentence I like saying about Donald Trump, he has been better than all of his Republican predecessors on the issue of gay rights. And to be fair, supporting gay rights as a president is a very recent thing. If you were to have a contest for who has been the most pro-gay president, it would be a 3-horse race between Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump, because prior to them, no president cared. Bill Clinton tried, and Bill Clinton failed. Donald Trump is firmly the third horse in that race. Log Cabin think he is the front by a long way. One of the aspects of their ideological change is this notion of doublethink that I'm going to explore. This was not something I went in thinking I was going to find. Like, I went into this study looking at populist rhetoric and authoritarian rhetoric. This is not even a variable in my study that I operationalized. This is a running theme that I just kept seeing in little rhetoric nuances when you compared what they said about a thing to what they said later and to what they said after that. To the point where, with the methodology I had, I didn't really know how to operationalize it. And I went into my Viva and I talked about it as just a supporting thing. And my external examiner said, this is brilliant, make it a chapter in and of itself, because you need to talk about this. So that's why I'm here today. I noticed it in 3 key areas. Log Cabin's portrayal of left-wing homophobia versus right-wing homophobia, their selective denial of LGBT victimhood, and in a very select case, their treatment of the Bostock versus Clayton County Supreme Court decision. I'm just going to let that siren go past for a second. I'm going to go through each of these in turn and show how, again, the key issue with doublethink is not so much that you hold 2 issues simultaneously, it's that you flip and flip back. That you always take into your mind that Big Brother is always right. So we're going to watch Log Cabin change their beliefs and change them back a few times on key issues. First thing is how their portrayal of left-wing versus right-wing homophobia. The tweet on the left is, I know it's not particularly clear, the text says, was Hillary Clinton in support of gay rights when it mattered? No. It contains a link to, on the next slide I'll show you, a YouTube video on Log Cabin's YouTube account. There is a clip show of several times between 2001 and 2004 that Hillary Clinton denied that she supported gay marriage. On the right, sorry, that tweet was sent in January 2016, so we are 10 months out from the 2016 election at that point. On the right is a tweet linking to an article from the Daily Caller by David Benkoff saying, stop calling Mike Pence homophobic. And it was about an article that defended his record and claimed that everything he had done, particularly more recently at that point as governor of Indiana prior to running as vice president, had not been about trying to hurt gay people. It had been about trying to promote Christian faith and religious decision making. So that it was wrong, therefore, to call him homophobic because he had not intended anything out of malice. The key thing is, if you take both of these arguments in isolation, they both make sense. The early one is talking about how we shouldn't be trusting Clinton now because in their mind, according to their rhetoric, she's on our side now because it's politically safe. It is now functionally unacceptable to be a Democrat and be anti-gay rights, so Clinton's come out in support of it. But back when it carried risk, she was against it. That video actually ends with, of all things, bear in mind this is a Republican organisation, it ends with an excerpt from an interview with Bernie Sanders making that exact point about how, you know, it's okay to change your mind, but what matters is standing up when there is a risk to it. For reference, Clinton had obviously been First Lady when her husband signed the Defence of Marriage Act into law. Sanders, to his credit, had voted against that as a senator. 11 months on, straight after that election again, so this tweet is sent like within days of Trump winning, tweet 138, they are saying the complete other thing, the complete opposite of, forgive Mike Pence because his views have changed. Yes, he said some homophobic things in Congress in 2001 and through 2010, but you know, he didn't want to hurt anybody as governor of Indiana, he just wanted to promote Christian ideals. He had, to his credit, he'd written this op-ed in the Washington Post about how if I saw a business in Indiana refuse service to a gay couple, I wouldn't support that business. I wouldn't go to that restaurant. I wouldn't buy from that business. It was about forgiving him, saying that at the end of the day, his view isn't malicious anymore. It's in the context of his religious beliefs, and that he is working for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump ostensibly is not a homophobe, so Pence's views don't matter. Again, an internally coherent argument about people change their minds and we should welcome their change of viewpoint. But you can't have it both ways. Having a homophobic political record, if you're a Democrat, is unforgivable and you should always have it held against you. Having a homophobic political record, if you're a Republican, is fine and you should be offered forgiveness. The issue is played two different ways. Lest you think that this is just an issue with two tweets in 2016 about that were 11 months apart and maybe Log Cabin changed their minds at that point. They did it again in 2020. These two tweets were sent from the same account within 2 weeks of each other, a couple of months out from the 2020 election. They both link to articles on getoutspoken.com, which is a media website launched by Log Cabin in 2020 that I recommend you only read if you have a stiff drink, because I kid you not, the way I keep describing it to people is it is gay Breitbart. It is not a fun read. The tweet on the left links to an article about Joe Biden having a long homophobic record as a congressman and how Log Cabin has got the receipts for all the terrible things Joe Biden has said and Joe Biden has done. And to be fair, he's not got the greatest record if you look at him from like 2007 and earlier. 2 weeks later, in the intervening 2 weeks, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away. And there's a bit of a furor about who Donald Trump is going to have to replace her. Log Cabin sent this tweet about highlighting several of the potential candidates that were considered frontrunners for that new Supreme Court seat, and how gay activist organisations like GLAAD and the Human Rights Campaign were objecting to them because they were ostensibly homophobic or they'd said homophobic things in the past. And Log Cabin argued, you can't hold that against them because when they said it, it was a perfectly normal viewpoint that everybody had at the time. Even Joe Biden thought that at the time. The fact that Joe Biden had thought it at the time was something considered unforgivable and you should keep the receipts about 2 weeks earlier, but now it's evidence that it's fine. Again, having a homophobic record when you are in the context of a Democratic presidential candidate is a terrible thing. Having even Joe Biden having a homophobic record mentioned in the context of a Republican Supreme Court candidate is suddenly forgivable. How they look at the past changes depending on the context with which they are trying to make the current point and whether or not they are trying to exonerate a Republican or criticize a Democrat. It was also how they look at right-wing homophobia. Having already established that they look at right-wing homophobia as fundamentally different from the left-wing, they also look at the same aspects of right-wing homophobia depending on its proximity to the Trump administration quite differently as well. Mike Pence is always the crux here. Again, I mentioned Mike Pence had written that Washington Post article. The tweet on the left is a retweet several years on of the one he'd sent in 2015 linking to that article. Response to criticism from Elliot Page was not then out, hence dead name, sorry about that, is criticizing Mike Pence for hating gay people. Log Cabin rushed to his defense about how he's just there to support faith and he has no malice in his heart. They use that line a lot about malice, always qualifying that right-wing homophobia depends upon malice. They never make that distinction. If a left-wing person has ever said anything homophobic, they just assume malice is there. They will live in the technicalities to excuse it from the right. Excusing Mike Pence, making the argument he's just supporting faith, right? In 2020, the Texas Republican Party banned Log Cabin from attending the Texas Party's convention because Texas is as Texas does. Texas Republicans like to make sure they are the most right-wing Republicans. Log Cabin object to this loudly, calling it rank homophobia. The reason given was a Christian nationalist argument. The Texas Republicans didn't want some, I'm tripping over my words, but they didn't want, sin promoted as they saw it at the party convention. Right-wing religious homophobia in the context of something that is removed from the Trump administration, they attack. Right-wing religious homophobia in the context of the record of someone within the Trump administration, they bend over backwards to defend and jump at technicalities. I will grant there is an issue of severity here. Mike Pence, for his sins, was not the sort of person by 2015 that was going to yell at a gay person in the street. Greg Abbott might have been. There is an issue of severity here, but it is also the same, at its core, the same issue of Christian nationalist homophobia being played two different ways. So Log Cabin have this notion of what homophobia is and what counts as it, and whether or not it's forgivable, changes depending on context and then changes back. To me, that argument says that they haven't actually changed their definition of what is and isn't homophobia. They know precisely what it is. But they have an investment in making sure that they rhetorically locate it far away from the Trump administration. If Trump and Pence do it, somehow they will find a way to make it fine for anybody else, and it's bad, even if it is fundamentally the same issue. The other reason why I called this presentation Schrödinger's Homophobia is Alive and Dead is the next aspect, which is victimhood. Log Cabin consistently have this running theme in their online rhetoric that LGBT victimhood doesn't exist anymore, that we have everything we need. And this is not an argument that began with them. If you read, again, stiff drink, A Place at the Table by Bruce Bauer, which is the book that gave me the inspiration for my thesis title, Virtually Normal by Andrew Sullivan, these 1990s gay conservatives publishing pretty decently best-selling, like New York Times best-selling books, arguing that all the gay community needed was equal marriage and equal military service, and if people wanted to privately discriminate after that, we should let them, because we've got everything we needed for social aspect, and let everyone else just sit in their own lane. So this notion of we've got everything we needed, so victimhood doesn't exist anymore, didn't begin with Log Cabin. Log Cabin particularly, though, are very fond of trying to make the political left, the Democratic Party and gay activist organisations the enemy in this regard. The running theme in the rhetoric is that gay people aren't victimised anymore, but GLAAD, HRC and so on, they're only relevant as organisations if people feel victimised. Because if they feel victimised, they'll keep donating to them, they'll keep doing activism for them, they'll stay politically relevant, they'll keep their influence and so on. So Log Cabin, they promote this idea that that identity politics, is the word they like to throw in, is false, and it just exists to keep Democrats in power and keep these groups active. And that if gay people, this invariably leads to the usual "we are anti the woke mob" rhetoric. And if gay people broke their conditioning then and realised that they were finally free and equal, they wouldn't vote for the Democrats anymore. They keep consistently denying the existence of victimhood. Again, this is also some of that living in the technicalities thing. Again, though, I've talked about how they changed their viewpoint, and I've just stressed 6 or 7 times about how this is a consistent thing. Because when Log Cabin want to make an argument that aligns with conservative talking points elsewhere, they will suddenly remember en masse victimization of gay people. Tweet at the top there, links to an article in the Washington Post authored by a gay member of the National Rifle Association, and the log cabin are reproducing this verbatim. That gay people, the crux of the article was, gay people are constant victims of hate crime. We need to arm ourselves in order to be able to shoot back and defend ourselves. The Orlando massacre is cited quite a bit in this regard. The second set of tweets, albeit they were from earlier, linked to an article in the Washington Examiner written by one of the accounts. You'll notice I've kept all these anonymised, but one of the accounts that I looked at, the personal account of a log cabin leader, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Examiner. Log cabin love the Washington Examiner. I mean, it's one of America's most right-wing papers, but yeah. Wrote an op-ed in the Washington Examiner arguing that we needed to, this was back in, off the top of my head, 2017, about how we needed to overturn Roe versus Wade, and we needed to get the gay community should come out for pro-life, because eventually, I kid you not, this is the argument this thing goes with, eventually the gay gene will be found, because homosexuality is not a choice, therefore it must be genetic. Eventually the gay gene will be found and it will be screened for, and homophobic people will abort gay babies en masse in the womb, and we will have a quiet gay genocide through pro-choice measures. This is a group that denies the existence of victimhood all the damn time, and yet when they want to support gun rights, they appeal to en masse anti-gay hate crime. They will then flip back to, again, if you look at the order of these tweets, 819, 682, if I go back, they are denying the existence of victimhood before these tweets. They are denying it after it. They appeal to suddenly, oh yes, we are victimized to the point where people are actually trying to kill us all the time, so we need to shoot back. Or we are victimized because there's enough homophobes in America that there will be an en masse gay genocide if when the gay gene is found, and then they forget it again. The running theme there is that denying victimhood allows log cabin to maintain credibility within the Republican Party for various reasons. Chiefly, it presents an assimilated, non-radical front to the party. It allows them to show the other like organisations within the GOP, we're not going to step on anybody's toes. We've got what we want. We're not going to cause a stink. We're not here for left-wing identity politics. That's the Democrats, and they're radical, and we don't like them. We're nice and pleasant. The phrase "the good gays" has come up a couple of times. So yeah, presenting this, denying victimhood means that they can align themselves more readily with conservative policy. That's pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Don't think like you're a victim thing. It comes up in multiple aspects of right-wing policy in America. But they will remember the existence of victimhood if that helps them make a conservative argument about a different policy choice. Either way, they are fostering political capital within the Republican Party by doing it. Last thing was less a running theme and more a very specific one, but this is the thing that cottoned me on to the double standards and the doublethink sample, which is log cabin's approach to so-called activist judges. The Republican Party loves to bang on about the notion of an activist judiciary, about how civil rights groups want to flout the authority of the US Congress and like do an end run around the legislature to enact social change via the courts, and how this is wrong, supposedly. Log cabin did not stand for this position, and they don't currently. On screen are some examples. More than happy to celebrate the winning of gay marriage in the Supreme Court in 2015 and 2016. Very, very, very happy with that. That's not judicial fiat, that's fine. Even though the wider Republican Party is absolutely up in arms about this, log cabin love it. Particularly, I want to draw some attention here, they love it because they can credit it to Republicans. Anthony Kennedy, for those who don't know, was appointed by Ronald Reagan. Reagan, no friend of the gay community by any stretch of the imagination. If you told me that Anthony Kennedy could drink for free in every gay bar in America, I would believe you, because he came up to the plate for the gay community on the court multiple times. He was not just the swing vote that secured several Supreme Court victories for the community. He was the man that wrote the decisions. Roma versus Evans, Lawrence versus Texas, United States versus Windsor, Obergefell versus Hodges. It's him every time. Log Cabin, that tweet was sent the day the Obergefell decision was handed down, and Log Cabin immediately try and credit it to Reagan. They make a point to know he is a Reagan appointee. This is suddenly a Republican victory. 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away. They claim that the left is melting down about how clearly whoever's going to be on the court next will be anti-LGBT. And again, they bring it back to every single pro-LGBT Supreme Court ruling was written by a justice appointed by a Republican. Side note, they are technically wrong about that. There was one written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in that time, but albeit Kennedy voted for it. Kennedy did do the other ones to his credit. So again, this is not a group that has a problem with an activist judiciary, or the notion, I would argue, completely made up notion of an activist judiciary. They are perfectly happy to win rights in the Supreme Court. The Trump court, so to speak, got its big test on gay rights in over 2019 and 2020 in the case Bostock versus Clayton County, which was a series of gay and transgender plaintiffs had been bringing suit in federal courts over the last decade about how they had been variously discriminated against or fired from their jobs for their identity, and eventually in 2019 all these cases get smushed together and brought before SCOTUS. The Trump administration filed a series of amicus curiae briefs, which are friend of the court briefs, they're basically designed to offer legal advice and a legal opinion from the Justice Department to the Supreme Court. And these briefs argue that it was the opinion of the Trump DOJ that LGBT people did not have workplace anti-discrimination protections granted by the Civil Rights Act. To be fair, the technical wording of the Civil Rights Act says that you cannot discriminate based on sex. Previous, namely Barack Obama's DOJ, had interpreted that to include protections for sexuality and gender identity, and, spoiler alert, that is also the decision the Supreme Court reached in this case. The logic being that, yeah, discrimination against sexuality is discrimination against sex, because if you would fire a woman for having a wife, but you won't fire a man for having a wife, you are discriminating against sex. Log Cabin jumped to Trump's defense, claiming that what he's done is not homophobic, that the left is overreacting, and arguing that it is wrong for the gay community to be doing this in the first place, that our rights should be won in Congress, that this is judicial fiat, and so on. Log Cabin basically, again, this is over a very geographically bounded period of time, a couple of months, like November to December 2019. They are penning op-eds in the Washington Examiner, the Washington Post. You know, the Civil Rights Act should be amended by law, not judicial fiat. Suddenly, this notion of an activist judiciary is a problem. They claim that the left is trying to have it both ways, because if the Civil Rights Act always protected gay people, what was the point of the last however many decades of gay rights activism? So clearly the left is having it both ways. They absolutely melt down about this, bending over backwards to qualify that what Trump has done is correct, and that what the plaintiffs are doing by trying to get their rights given to them in the Supreme Court is wrong. And then they go quiet on it for 6 months because the court adjourns, and the decision eventually comes back in June, July 2020. And suddenly Log Cabin are all for it again, because the man that wrote that decision was Neil Gorsuch, who had been appointed by Donald Trump. All of a sudden, this is a landmark case supporting LGBT rights in the workplace that they make a point to credit to Gorsuch so that they can also then indirectly credit to Trump. They never mention the notion of activist judiciaries ever again. And to my knowledge, again, my sample went up to January 2021. To my knowledge, they have not given a toss about the Supreme Court since. They invent this spectre of suddenly it's wrong for us to get our rights in the Supreme Court, because that is what Trump is saying at that point. The second he can then be credited with the win, because Gorsuch came out on the gay community's side, it's fine again. So what have I been driving at for the last half an hour, 40 minutes or so? Log Cabin selectively changed their viewpoint on several key issues related to LGBT rights. What qualifies as homophobia and how should it be judged? Do LGBT people experience victimhood at all? And what is the legitimate way for LGBT rights to be won? What they think on this will change and change back again, depending on what is the Republican Party and what is Donald Trump specifically saying on it. Big Brother is always right, even if Big Brother is asking you to believe something that contradicts what you thought was true a minute ago and what you will think is true in a minute's time. This feeds into my wider conclusions about homo-authoritarianism, because Log Cabin, they appear to be a fringe organisation within American politics. And for most of their history, that's been true. But under Trump, they got as close to the mainstream as as they have ever been. They got, Trump was, and that photo I had on the first slide of him with the rainbow flag is not photoshopped. That is a photo he took at a 2016 rally in Colorado with someone, a gay member of the audience, handed in that flag. He was very proud to take Log Cabin's endorsement of him in 2020. He appointed several of their members to the executive and the judiciary. Most famously, he got a couple of Log Cabin members onto lower courts, the Patrick Bamate on the Ninth Circuit. The most famous, Greg Angelo, the man that used to run Log Cabin, spent some time in the executive office of the president, got really into the inner circle there. Most famously, he appointed Richard Grenell, a member of the Los Angeles Log Cabin Republicans, as ambassador to Germany, and later as acting director of national intelligence, meaning that Trump was the first president to put an openly gay man in the cabinet. Log Cabin loved it. This is as close to the Republican mainstream, the Trump inner circle, as they have ever gotten. And my argument is that they have consciously rewarded that with absolute loyalty. This is a problem for a variety of reasons, namely because if you take on the notion that Big Brother is always right, and you are prepared to defend Big Brother even if he is acting in a discriminatory manner and legitimizing discrimination, you as a gay activist organisation have lost the credibility to meaningfully recognise and oppose discrimination. You can basically be used to legitimise hurt towards this community. Log Cabin will consistently recontextualise anti-LGBT actions into a manner that is acceptable and they can defend, and that is something that somehow is actually a good thing. I kid you not, I mentioned that gay spoken, that Gay Bright Bible website. I kid you not, in 2020 they had an article on there about how if Obergefell gets overturned, that's fine, because we'll just return gay marriage to the states and we'll have a meaningful debate about it as a society. Even that wasn't a bad thing to them. So not only does you have this notion of you are losing the ability to meaningfully stand for gay rights by doing this, you also are risking democracy itself, because if you are constantly legitimising the actions of an authority figure, that leads you on to other problems that they do if they're abusing their power and you defend them. Log Cabin defended Trump's bought into the stolen election narrative. People were spotted with rainbow banners in the storming of the Capitol building. I cannot confirm that. I know at least one high-profile influencer affiliated with Log Cabin went to prison for his role in the January 6th storming. I cannot confirm the extent to which Log Cabin themselves were there, but he was. And this might just, the wider argument is this may go on to be a model not just of Trump and one specific gay Republican group. We have seen a rise in far-right leaders around the world, particularly with the homo-nationalism I mentioned at the start of the PowerPoint. A rise in far-right leaders from Marine Le Pen, Benjamin Netanyahu, the further right figures in the British Conservative Party, will speak to the gay community. They will take on board the notion of gay rights as a way to enact a wider far-right agenda. This doublethink homo-authoritarianism may be a model for how gay rights groups get robbed of their capacity to fight discrimination. It may be something that we see wider, and I think this is something that research should be directed at going forward. I have been tripping over my words for the last 10 minutes or so, so I think that is a good place to wrap it up. And thank you for having me, and I would love to take some questions.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting and illuminating, and I learned a lot. Should we stop the recording?
Yes.
So that we maybe feel more comfortable.
Yes, give us 2 seconds. Where's the...
More?
Just recording.